What if your Malibu estate sat on water and the IRS couldn't touch it the same way? This is not a super yacht. No engine, no captain, no itinerary. It's a permanently moored, architect-designed floating residence. A full estate, anchored in place, sitting on water indefinitely. We're talking 10,000 square feet of glass, steel, and engineered concrete, comparable in footprint to the most expensive estates on Malibu's Carbon Beach. The difference is what sits underneath it. Here's the first engineering question that stops most people cold. A 10,000 square foot glass and steel structure typically weighs around 45 to 90 metric tons, depending on design and materials used. How does that not sink straight to the bottom? The answer is Archimedes' principle applied at industrial scale. A pontoon hull, a sealed concrete or steel barge, displaces a volume of water equal to the structure's total weight. Displace enough water, and the mansion floats. The pontoons in premium floating homes aren't hollow steel drums. They're reinforced concrete caissons, the same structural form used in the Golden Gate suspension foundations, engineered to resist cracking, corrosion, and decades of wave fatigue. But here's where it gets harder. Floating is the easy part. The real engineering problem is keeping a 10,000 square foot structure from drifting, rotating, or slamming into a neighboring dock during a storm surge. The solution is a pre-tensioned, multi-point anchor array, the same principle used in cable-stayed bridges like the Millau Viaduct to manage asymmetric lateral loads. Multiple anchor lines run at calculated angles to the seabed, each pre-tensioned to counteract the specific tidal and wind loads at that exact location. In protected harbors, engineers often replace open water anchoring with mooring dolphins, steel or concrete piles driven into the harbor floor, with the floating structure attached via flexible guide brackets that allow vertical tidal movement. Now, a question most people never think to ask. What stops water from creeping in from below over years? The answer is freeboard calculation, the engineered margin between the waterline and the lowest interior deck, combined with active bilge monitoring systems. The glass walls create a separate engineering problem. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels can weigh 800 kilograms each. Place too many on one side, and the entire platform tilts toward the heavy edge. Weight distribution must be calculated to the kilogram. Here's where engineering meets finance, and where it gets genuinely surprising. In most jurisdictions, a permanently moored floating home isn't classified as real property the way a land-based house is. It occupies an entirely different legal category. In California, one of the most active floating home markets in the US, floating homes are classified as real property and are subject to property taxes rather than registration fees. On a structure valued at $20 million, the annual difference can run into hundreds of thousands of dollars saved every single year. That brings us to a misconception worth correcting directly. Felix Preen, the investor who retired at 40 and now teaches wealth-building strategy, frames it this way. You can't save your way to this level of wealth. The data backs him up. Over the 20 years ending in 2023, the median US savings account returned roughly 1.5% annually in real terms, while the S&P 500 compounded at about 8.69% annually. Savings accounts lose ground to inflation. Real wealth accumulates through assets that compound, not cash that erodes. The $5.6 trillion injected through pandemic-era stimulus created what economist Mohamed El-Erian of Allianz called the inflation trap, a sustained erosion of purchasing power that punishes anyone holding idle cash while rewarding those holding appreciating assets. Here's a trend that reframes everything we just covered. Searches for buildable waterfront land are up 97% year over year, a phenomenon analysts are calling land maxing. ultra-high net worth buyers are acquiring sites specifically to float structures on them. The logic is straightforward. Acquiring riparian water rights or a long-term harbor mooring permit costs a fraction of purchasing equivalent waterfront acreage. You pay for the right to sit on the water, not for the water itself. Sophisticated floating home buyers rarely hold their wealth in a single asset class. A standard recommendation at this tier is a 5 to 15% gold allocation, specifically as a hedge against the debt spiral that inflates currency and erodes bond values. Beyond gold, the $2.5 trillion AI build-out, a figure cited in Goldman Sachs' 2023 infrastructure report and anchored by companies like Nvidia and Palantir, represents the compounding asset class, widening the gap between those building wealth and those watching it drain away. There's a parallel wealth vehicle documented extensively in institutional defense sector research. The Golden Dome strategy centers on RTX's dominance through its Patriot missile system monopoly, which generates recurring government contract revenue regardless of broader market conditions. Felix Pren has flagged this as one of the most overlooked compounding plays available to retail investors today. Meanwhile, the Poodle Plan, a term coined by Felix Pren to describe the Federal Reserve's shift toward accommodative policy under sustained political pressure, signals that low real interest rates may persist longer than consensus forecasts, making hard assets more attractive to those who understand the dynamic. Return to that floating mansion for a moment. Over a 10-year hold, the vessel classification tax advantage on a $20 million structure can accumulate to over $2 million in avoided property taxes, money that reinvests, compounds, and builds further. The floating home trend has downstream investment implications. Small-cap home builders specializing in modular and marine construction sit directly in the path of the landmaxing wave. According to SPDR, S&P Home Builders ETF composition data, retail ownership of marine and modular construction subsector stocks sits below 3%, a historically low allocation relative to the sector's recent revenue growth. Here's the counterintuitive risk that catches buyers off guard. Not every coastal jurisdiction permits permanent floating residences. San Francisco Bay's Regional Water Quality Control Board blocked a proposed luxury floating compound in Sausalito in 2019, citing environmental impact review requirements, after the buyer had already spent over $800,000 on preliminary engineering. Sophisticated buyers address this before spending $1 on construction. The standard process involves commissioning a full riparian rights analysis and pre-application meetings with harbor authorities, often a 6 to 12-month process before any pontoon is poured. The construction cost on a 10,000 square foot floating home typically runs over $1 million, with larger custom designs potentially exceeding $3 million, with the pontoon foundation accounting for roughly 30% of total cost, more than any single above-water structural element. Resale dynamics are fundamentally different. A floating home's value isn't tied to land appreciation. There is no land. It's tied to the mooring permit's transferability, the structure's engineering certification status, and the scarcity of permitted harbor locations. Here's a gap that surprises even experienced real estate attorneys. Standard property insurers won't underwrite a floating home. Coverage must be sourced through marine insurance markets, Lloyd's of London syndicates being the dominant underwriters at this asset tier. Zoom out, and the floating mansion model reveals something specific about how serious wealth builders think. They don't ask what an asset costs, they ask what category it falls into, because category determines tax treatment, and tax treatment determines real return. The 97% surge in buildable land searches isn't a real estate trend, it's a capital repositioning signal. In Sausalito, Seattle's Lake Union, and Amsterdam's IJ Harbor, three of the world's most active floating home markets, permitted mooring locations have appreciated faster than comparable waterfront land parcels, over the past 5 years, according to local harbor authority transaction records. Here's the detail almost no buyer thinks to ask about until it's too late. Mooring permits expire. In Seattle's Lake Union, standard harbor mooring permits run on 10-year renewable terms. And renewal isn't guaranteed. At least 2 high-value floating homes sold in the past decade were stranded when permit renewals were denied, leaving owners with a multi-million-dollar structure and nowhere legal to put it. The engineering is the easy part. The permit is the asset. The wealthiest builders aren't smarter about money, they're smarter about categories. So here's your concrete next step. Before your next real estate purchase, ask your attorney whether the structure qualifies as a vessel under your state's classification code. That single question could change your annual tax bill by more than your mortgage payment.